Watch this autonomous drone as it navigates a large industrial space. It suddenly swerves and crashes into a wall. The hardware is intact and the source code executed perfectly. The failure occurred because the physical sticker corrupted the system's underlying mathematical logic. Historically, cybersecurity operated inside a strict boundary of determinism. Defenders protected static code and explicit network configurations against known exploits with predictable outcomes. This matrix maps our defensive landscape. The y-axis tracks the target asset, moving from hard code to machine learning models. The x-axis tracks the defense methodology, moving from deterministic rules to probabilistic logic. Standard security mechanisms, like firewalls and signature-based antivirus software, lock neatly into the bottom left quadrant. They are deterministic tools defending explicit code. When we introduce artificial intelligence, the target asset shifts to a model. The empty upper right quadrant represents systems that operate probabilistically. Traditional defenses cannot parse errors like poisoned training data, evaded models, or algorithmic bias. Securing this infrastructure requires a defense that merges adversarial machine learning tactics with organizational governance and strict professional ethics. As these systems move from isolated labs to critical infrastructure, the engineering challenge centers on the governance of unpredictable logic. The cornerstone of traditional information security is the ISC2 Code of Professional Ethics. It functions as a rigid operational algorithm designed to resolve conflicts of interest. This diagram illustrates the hierarchy of the ISC2 canons. Notice how Canon I, the mandate to protect society and infrastructure, physically supersedes Canon III, the duty to provide service to principals. If a security professional discovers a critical vulnerability in a public utility, and their employer orders them to keep it secret for financial reasons, the framework mathematically forces the operator to disclose the flaw. Public safety overrides corporate loyalty. This ethical rigor is paired with technical rigor through methodologies like STRIDE threat modeling. Developed by Microsoft engineers, STRIDE provides a structured mnemonic to proactively identify exploits, like spoofing or tampering, during the architecture phase, long before any code is written. Look at this traditional data flow diagram. By mapping STRIDE categories to the discrete processes and data stores, security teams establish firm, linear trust boundaries. This deterministic framework is highly effective for environments where human engineers explicitly define every possible input and output, creating a baseline of total control. But artificial intelligence entirely disrupts this rigid control state. Explicit code is replaced by neural pipelines, moving the primary attack surface away from traditional network infrastructure and directly into data and mathematics. As the traditional data flow diagram melts and morphs into a machine learning pipeline, massive new vulnerabilities are exposed at the data ingestion and model inference phases. Infiltration at the ingestion phase is known as training data poisoning. Attackers target the data pipeline to subtly corrupt how the model learns to perceive the world. Researchers at the University of Chicago developed a tool called Nightshade, which injects specific mathematical triggers into the pixels of digital art. When large language models scrape these images, the hidden triggers cause the system to misidentify objects entirely. Threats also emerge after the model is deployed. These are inference-time attacks, commonly known as model evasion. In a white box evasion attack, the adversary has full access to the target model's architecture and parameters, using that data to calculate deliberate errors. This vector graphic represents a stop sign overlaid with the optimization formula for a technique called projected gradient descent. The adversary uses the model's own gradients to maximize the loss function within a microscopic perturbation budget. This generates a layer of calculated static that rewrites the underlying math while remaining invisible to the human eye. Because the math is corrupted, the AI outputs an unrelated classification, interpreting the stop sign as a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit or a frisbee. In the physical world, wearing specific adversarial patches on clothing easily renders this pedestrian invisible to automated digital tracking systems. These attacks exploit the foundational probability of the model itself. Because standard security testing expects binary pass or fail results, it is completely blind to these mathematical manipulations. Beyond malicious external actors, AI introduces structural failures when used for automated decision-making. Algorithmic bias rarely stems from developer malice. It occurs when inherited historical traits and inequalities are mapped directly into the training data. When deployed in high-stakes fields like employment screening or criminal justice, these automated models scale and amplify existing societal disparities. This cyclical flowchart illustrates the feedback loop of bias. Historical data trains the model, which generates biased outputs. Those outputs are then ingested as new historical data, mathematically compounding the skew with every cycle. We see this in practice. An early Amazon hiring tool systematically downgraded female resumes based on male-dominated historical tech data. The Compass system misclassified the recidivism risk of minority defendants at twice the rate of white defendants. The proprietary nature of these algorithms creates a black box. Individuals impacted by automated rejections cannot see or challenge the mathematical logic used against them. A lack of mathematical transparency directly strips individuals of due process, turning a technical oversight into a severe ethical breach. To manage the chaotic nature of AI pipelines, international bodies established specific sociotechnical standards, notably the NIST AI Risk Management Framework and ISO/IEC 42001. The NIST framework requires organizations to iteratively govern, map, measure, and manage their systems. This transitions operations from a state of unconscious risk to proactive lifecycle oversight. On the tactical floor, traditional security operations centers must evolve into AI SOCs, capable of detecting machine-speed probabilistic attacks. This split screen contrasts the two methodologies. On the left, traditional antivirus software scans for known malware hashes. On the right, an AI SOC establishes a behavioral baseline and instantly identifies deviations, like irregular API calls from legitimate system tools. Security teams achieve this readiness through AI red teaming. Instead of probing for open ports or infrastructure gaps, they test the probabilistic behavior of the model, forcing hallucinations and misuse scenarios. To standardize this process, the MIT Corporation launched ATLAS, the Adversarial Threat Landscape for Artificial Intelligence Systems. It provides a common taxonomy for categorizing machine learning attack tactics. By combining the ATLAS taxonomy with behavioral analytics and strict ISO governance, defenders gain a structured methodology to fight back against invisible mathematical exploits. Returning to our matrix, the empty probabilistic quadrant begins to fill. We map MITRE ATLAS, behavioral operations, and rigorous NIST governance directly over the target model. But a mathematically robust system is useless if it operates devoid of socio-technical oversight. At the absolute center, we place the ethical mandate. The obligation to protect public trust locks the entire architecture together. Operators must commit to continuous learning, relentlessly mapping new machine learning attacks, and actively mitigating algorithmic bias within their datasets. In the era of artificial intelligence, professional ethics and public safety are no longer secondary considerations. They are the strict foundational algorithm.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into some absolutely fascinating source material that takes the complex, honestly sometimes chaotic world of digital threats and breaks it down into a really clear visual journey. Because let's face it, managing digital risk isn't just an IT problem anymore. It is literally vital for organizational survival. We're going to explore the dual architecture of cybersecurity risk management and see exactly how the sources suggest blending hard, cold mathematics with sharp human intuition. So how do you actually put a price tag on a cyber disaster before it even happens? It's kind of the ultimate question raised by the data, isn't it? As digital transformation accelerates, the potential for financial, legal, and reputational harm just skyrockets. If an attacker breaches your database or, say, a flood destroys your servers, the stakes are monumental. We absolutely need a system to evaluate these risks strategically, so we aren't just crossing our fingers and hoping for the best. Okay, let's dive into this by looking at what the material calls the absolute bedrock of information security. It's called the CIA triad. And no, we're not talking about the government agency here. This stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The text outlines that a risk management program's primary job is protecting this very triad. Confidentiality keeps your sensitive data shielded from prying eyes. Integrity ensures nobody has secretly tampered with your data or your systems. And availability? That just means your legitimate users can actually access the resources when they need them. The whole goal here is to use this triad to move your organization from a panicked, reactive posture into a state of true predictive clarity. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the strategic risk imperative. Second, quantitative analysis, which is the calculus. Third, qualitative expert judgment. Fourth, the hybrid frontier. And finally, strategic risk response. Section 1. The strategic risk imperative, moving from reactive to predictive. Now, to make that predictive shift, we need to completely reframe risk as a core pillar of enterprise governance. And what's really interesting here is how the sources translate abstract technical vulnerabilities directly into executive budgets using the calculus of financial exposure. We start with single loss expectancy, or SLE. To find your SLE, you just multiply the asset value by the exposure factor. The asset value is exactly what it sounds like. What is the thing actually worth? And the exposure factor is simply the percentage of that value you'd expect to lose if a specific threat actually happens. Let me give you a quick story to bring this math to life. Imagine a typical employee's laptop. The hardware itself, maybe it's only $1,000. But let's say that laptop is unencrypted and happens to hold $50,000 worth of sensitive, personally identifiable information, or PII. Well, your total asset value is actually $51,000. If that laptop gets stolen, the loss is complete. That's a 100% exposure factor, meaning your single loss expectancy for that one stolen laptop is a complete $51,000. It's a massive financial hit from one tiny little device. But, a single snapshot isn't really enough for long-term planning, which brings us to the annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. To get this, we multiply that single snapshot, or SLE, by the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO. Now, ARO is just a forecast of how many times this event is going to happen in a given year. If a company statistically loses 25 laptops a year, the ARO is 25. On the flip side, if a data center might flood once every 4 years, the ARO is 0.25. Multiplying these gives you your projected annual cost for that specific risk. And here is where it gets super interesting, because this math leads us directly to the economic justification for security. The fundamental rule outlined in the text is this: you should never, ever spend more to protect an asset than the value that protection actually provides. I mean, if a hard drive failure costs you $1,000, you're not going to spend $5,000 a year on redundant storage to prevent it, right? To figure out if a security tool is worth it, you calculate the countermeasure value. You take the previous ALE, subtract the new, safer ALE, and then subtract the annualized total cost of ownership of the security tool itself. And this calculation perfectly illustrates the reality of residual risk. When you look at the ALE before your countermeasure versus the ALE after, you quickly realize that perfect security, it's a total myth. You can literally never reduce your risk to zero. The real goal is to ensure the total cost of ownership actually saves you money, leaving you with what we call a residual ALE, which is basically a level of risk that is financially acceptable to the business. Moving on to Section 3, qualitative expert judgment. But let's be honest, numbers don't tell the whole story, do they? Some risks, like ruined employee morale or really messy vendor politics, are just incredibly difficult to measure in dollars and cents. For these subjective factors, the material relies on expert judgment and visual anchors, like a probability impact matrix. Rather than doing dense math, we use a 5x5 grid based on likelihood and impact. It standardizes severity, so literally anyone can understand it instantly. You've got the green zone for low-priority risks we can track periodically, the yellow zone for medium priorities that need regular management, and the red zone, scores 15 to 25, for high-priority, absolutely intolerable risks that demand immediate action. It's fast, it's descriptive, and it's absolutely perfect for when you just don't have precise data. But how do we actually get those subjective scores without, a ton of human bias? Enter the Delphi technique. It's this brilliant, structured way to gather anonymous expert consensus. In the initial round, experts answer open-ended questionnaires. Then, all that feedback is summarized and sent back out in an iteration phase. The experts look at the group data and refine or adjust their opinions, slowly moving toward a median viewpoint, until they reach a consensus. The genius of this is that it completely eliminates the dominant voice effect. No single loud executive can sway the entire room's decision.
And you know what the best output of all this qualitative analysis often is? It's storytelling. The source material captures this perfectly, stating, "Storytelling brings cybersecurity concepts to life by personalizing the consequences of failure." Look, if you walk into a boardroom and just spew technical jargon, executives' eyes are going to glaze over. But if you tell a narrative about a specific phishing attempt targeting a hero employee in accounting who actually recognized the threat and saved the day, those concepts resonate. Stories establish a collective understanding of risk far, far better than spreadsheets alone.
Section 4. The hybrid frontier. Here's the deal. The most resilient organizations out there completely reject the whole data versus intuition debate. It's not quantitative or qualitative. It is absolutely both. Think of it as speaking two different languages. Quantitative analysis is objective and numerical, but it's slow and resource-intensive. Qualitative is subjective, descriptive, and fast. The texts show us how hybrid risk professionals use quantitative math to secure the budget from the board. Speaking in dollars and cents. But they use qualitative storytelling to actually shape the operational culture on the ground. You need the hard data to prioritize and the soft context to execute.
Let's see how this builds into an actual operational standard. Standardized frameworks like the NIST Special Publication 830 ensure that no critical assets fall through the cracks. It's a life cycle. First, you prepare by clearly defining your scope. Then, you conduct the assessment to identify your threats. Third, you communicate those findings to your stakeholders. And most crucially, step 4, maintain. Because a risk assessment isn't just a one-and-done project, it's a living, breathing document that requires continuous monitoring as the threat landscape inevitably shifts.
And finally, Section 5, Strategic Risk Response.
Okay, so now that we've comprehensively measured our risks using both math and human judgment, what do we actually do about them? Well, the sources outline 4 primary actionable choices. First is risk avoidance. If a threat is just too extreme, you simply stop the activity causing it. Second is risk mitigation. This is the most common one, where you apply controls to reduce the likelihood or the impact. Third is risk transference. This is where you shift the financial burden to a third party, like buying cybersecurity insurance. And finally, risk acceptance. If a risk is super minor or fixing it costs more than the potential loss, you consciously choose to just live with it.
But how do you pick which response to use? Well, that all comes down to your organization's risk appetite. This is the amount of risk your company is actually willing to take to hit its goals, which you always have to weigh against your risk capacity, meaning the absolute maximum hit you could take and still survive. And remember, every single response decision you make has to be formally documented in a risk register to maintain transparency, accountability, and repeatability across the whole enterprise. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative question. Take a really hard look at your own hybrid defense strategy. Does your organization's mathematical risk budget, those hard quantitative dollars and cents, truly align with its qualitative human risk appetite? Bridging that gap is the true hallmark of cybersecurity leadership in an uncertain world. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I really hope this gives you the tools you need to see your risks more clearly than ever before. Catch you next time. When a facility like this goes dark, the immediate challenge is technical: restoring power, rebooting servers, and verifying physical hardware. However, the risk to the organization extends far beyond the server room. Business continuity management has transitioned from a peripheral IT checklist into a primary pillar of corporate governance. Organizations must now maintain continuous operations against systemic failures, regardless of the cause. In a 24/7 digital economy, the financial math leaves zero margin for error. For major retailers during peak seasons, an offline application drains over $500,000 per hour in direct revenue. This pressure is compounding as enterprises migrate mission-critical operations out of local data centers and into multi-tenant cloud environments. Modern technical recovery is tied directly to strict, non-negotiable legal mandates regarding data protection and accessibility. Restoring the system is only half the battle. The other half is proving the recovery meets global regulatory standards. Effective strategies have abandoned scenario-based guessing. Instead of building separate plans for floods or ransomware, organizations use impact-based planning. They focus entirely on the loss of the asset, like a database or a workforce, ensuring the response is versatile enough for any trigger. Building this type of legally compliant cloud architecture requires a specific investigative tool. Everything begins with the empirical data generated by a business impact analysis. The business impact analysis, or BIA, acts as the analytical engine of continuity planning. It prioritizes system components by directly correlating them to the mission-critical business functions they support. While a standard risk assessment attempts to identify what could happen and how likely it is, the BIA focuses strictly on the cost of failure. A risk assessment identifies the probability of a server crash. The BIA identifies that losing a payroll system creates unacceptable legal and operational liabilities within 48 hours. This horizontal timeline maps exactly how the BIA translates those financial and legal impacts into precise measurements of time, radiating outward from the moment of failure. The absolute existential boundary of organizational tolerance is the maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD. This is the exact hour when a disruption causes irreversible consequences, such as terminal regulatory penalties or the total loss of a customer base. Because it represents the threshold of organizational survival, the MTD is always determined first. It forms a strict mathematical ceiling for every decision that follows. Looking backward into the past, we have the Recovery Point Objective, or RPO. This metric defines the maximum amount of data loss the organization can tolerate from the point the incident occurred. If the RPO is 24 hours, a nightly off-site backup is sufficient. If the RPO is near zero, the enterprise must utilize continuous, real-time data replication. This specific metric drives the bulk of modern storage infrastructure spending. Moving forward from the disruption, the Recovery Time Objective, or RTO, sets the target timeframe for the technical restoration of the system. It answers how fast the servers must be brought back online. The RTO must always be scheduled well inside the maximum tolerable downtime. Technical complications and validation delays are inevitable during a crisis, and the enterprise requires a buffer to stay within its survival limits. That buffer accounts for the resumption gap, measured as work recovery time. Powering on a server achieves the RTO, but making the business function operational requires additional hours to synchronize databases, check file integrity, and process manual backlogs. This creates the foundational rule of business continuity. The time it takes to fix the hardware, plus the time it takes to verify the data, must terminate before reaching the MTD deadline. Security leaders utilize these exact time variables to justify multi-million-dollar budgets. By translating a specific server outage into a defined dollar amount per hour, they provide executive management with the objective data required to approve high-availability redundancy. Without these quantified metrics, continuity planning relies on guesswork. Organizations end up overprotecting highly visible systems while leaving the underlying dependencies that actually run the business completely exposed. Technical restoration is only one variable in the resilience equation. As soon as systems go offline, the clock starts ticking on strict statutory and civil mandates. This matrix links our continuity metrics directly to their governing regulatory frameworks. Organizations do not dictate their own recovery speed. The law does. Under HIPAA, healthcare entities and their IT vendors are explicitly required to maintain contingency plans, data backups, and emergency mode operations to protect patient health information. Failure to comply triggers tiered penalties, reaching up to $1.5 million per violation category annually. The European Union's GDPR mandates privacy by design across all system architectures. In the event of an outage that exposes personal data, organizations have exactly 72 hours to report the incident, with penalties scaling up to 4% of their entire annual global revenue. For publicly traded companies, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requires rigorous internal IT controls. Systems handling financial reporting must be resilient to disasters to prevent unauthorized alterations, and the effectiveness of these controls must be personally certified by the CEO and CFO. Maintaining compliance with these distinct frameworks is difficult locally. Executing them across a multinational cloud deployment introduces severe geopolitical friction. The moment digital information crosses an ocean, it becomes subject to competing international jurisdictions. This creates a critical distinction between data residency, the physical geography where a server sits, and data sovereignty, which dictates the actual legal authority governing that information. Looking at this global map, we see the foundation of the cloud trilemma, a paradox that traps multinational providers between conflicting laws. The U.S. Cloud Act grants American law enforcement the authority to compel technology companies to hand over data, even if it is stored in a foreign jurisdiction. Simultaneously, the EU's GDPR strictly prohibits unapproved cross-border data transfers. Attempting to solve this through strict data localization forces records to never leave their origin country. However, this creates isolated data silos that drive up management costs and hinder global collaboration. A hybrid, multi-cloud approach provides a viable solution. Highly sensitive, sovereign data is partitioned into local private clouds, while less critical workloads leverage the massive scale of public cloud infrastructure. To protect the localized data, enterprises deploy encryption using self-managed keys. By maintaining exclusive control of the decryption mechanism, foreign government access requests aimed at the cloud provider are rendered mathematically ineffective. Digital sovereignty is a function of technical cryptographic control. These tools ensure that autonomous decision-making over data access remains with the owner, making a server's physical zip code secondary to the organization's actual legal authority. Hosting these strictly regulated workloads inside modern cloud providers requires specific architectural protections. This stack represents a multi-tenant environment where massive cost efficiency is achieved by sharing hardware among thousands of clients. For this to function securely, absolute isolation must be maintained across 3 distinct layers. At the base is data isolation. Tenant information is separated using unique database schemas and encryption keys to prevent cross-client data leakage. The middle layer manages resource isolation. It enforces strict hardware quotas so that one tenant experiencing a traffic spike cannot consume the CPU or memory required by other users on the same server. At the top is application isolation. This protects proprietary code execution and tenant-specific configurations from being accessed or influenced by external accounts. While the cloud provider engineers these isolation layers, managing the data inside them follows a strict operational boundary. This schematic illustrates the shared responsibility model, which enforces a division of security labor between the provider and the enterprise. The cloud service provider owns security of the cloud. They are responsible for the physical facilities, the hypervisor running the servers, and baseline network routing. The enterprise owns security in the cloud. The customer remains entirely responsible for classifying their data, patching applications, and managing identity access controls. Misunderstanding this strict boundary is the primary cause of cloud breaches. Organizations that assume the provider secures their files often leave storage buckets and access roles misconfigured, allowing attackers to move laterally across the network. Preventing these errors requires a rigid timeline. Cross-system dependencies must be mapped 3 to 6 months prior to a cloud migration, and automated posture management tools must be deployed to catch errors during the critical first 90 days post-launch. Migrating to a Tier 1 cloud provider does not outsource legal liability. The enterprise must actively architect its own compliant security policies inside the shared environment. True organizational resilience emerges only when the operational silos separating business continuity, cybersecurity, and regulatory compliance are entirely dismantled. These disciplines are mutually dependent. A cyber attack immediately triggers a continuity crisis, and a failure in compliance guarantees financial harm. Bringing them together requires collaborative governance, forcing distinct departments to adopt a unified language of risk. Under an enterprise risk taxonomy, technical vulnerabilities and compliance gaps are translated directly into business terms. A server misconfiguration is evaluated by its specific probability of revenue loss, giving executives the exact context needed to allocate resources effectively. Advanced governance, risk, and compliance platforms facilitate this by bridging operational safety procedures with automated technical scoring, ensuring that emergency failover plans adhere to corporate security policies. But an unverified plan is merely a theoretical document. This exercise report shows the results of a continuous validation program, a strict requirement mandated by the ISO 22301 framework. Strategies must be proven under simulated pressure. This validation operates in distinct tiers. Cross-functional tabletop exercises force teams to talk through escalation paths. Technical drills pull the plug on critical services to verify that actual recovery time objectives meet the mathematical baseline. And disciplined cyber forensics evaluate every real-world interruption to prevent recurrence. Integrating empirical BIA metrics with strict cloud isolation and continuous validation transforms resilience into a durable.
All right, let's get right into this explainer. Today, we're going to build a defensible organizational security posture from the absolute ground up. You can think of this whole process a lot like constructing a massive architectural blueprint. I mean, if you want a building to stand the test of time, withstand harsh weather, and actually protect the people inside, you can't just start throwing up walls and hoping for the best, right? You need a solid baseline strategy, precise structural framing, and a really rigorous set of codes to follow. And honestly, that is exactly what Domain 1 of the CISSP Common Body of Knowledge provides for information security.
So today's blueprint breaks down into 6 critical phases. We'll cover the core CIA triad, aligning security with business, the security policy hierarchy, legal standards of conduct, risk management and resilience, and finally, we'll wrap up with the human element. Starting off with Phase 1, the core CIA triad, which is quite literally the foundation of information security. We have to begin at the very bottom with the bedrock of our building. Every single security program out there rests on this tripartite model we universally know as the CIA triad. The C stands for confidentiality. This is your assurance that information is locked down and only accessible to those with explicitly granted authorization. In today's landscape, we maintain confidentiality through heavy-hitting technical safeguards, like AES 256 encryption, which renders your data entirely unreadable without the correct key, whether that data is just sitting idle on a server or flying across the internet. But you know, it's also about administrative protocols. Think strict non-disclosure agreements to prevent insider leaks. Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure your secrets actually stay secret.
Then we've got integrity. Now this is all about trustworthiness. We absolutely have to protect information from unauthorized modification, deletion, or corruption. Integrity is so vital because even a minor, seemingly insignificant unauthorized change can have catastrophic real-world consequences. Just imagine someone secretly altering a single decimal point on a massive corporate financial transaction, or even worse, changing a patient's medical dosage in a hospital database. To stop that, we ensure integrity using technical mechanisms like hashing algorithms and strict version control, so we always know our data is exactly what it claims to be.
And rounding out the triad is availability. This ensures that systems, applications, and data are always accessible to authorized users exactly when they need them. Now, unlike a confidentiality breach, which might hide in the shadows of your network for months on end, availability failures are immediate, they are loud, and they are incredibly disruptive. Just think about a massive DDoS attack or a ransomware infection that completely halts a global payroll system. Maintaining availability relies on things like load balancers, redundant power supplies, and cloud replications just to keep the lights on, no matter what hits you.
Now here's where it gets interesting, because there's an inherent strategic conflict here. These 3 pillars are constantly pushing and pulling against each other. For instance, if you implement highly complex encryption and require multiple layers of authentication to really lock down confidentiality, you're going to create system latency and friction for the end user. That actively reduces usability and can even end up hurting availability. So finding that perfect balance, one that actually aligns with your organization's specific risk appetite, is pretty much the ultimate challenge for any security architect.
Moving right along to Phase 2, aligning security with business, or what we can call the structural framing.
So you've got your foundation, but how do you actually align these security concepts with your business goals so you aren't just doing security for security's sake? It's fascinating how smart organizations will actually pair different governance frameworks to get this done. Take COVID 2019. Its primary audience is CIOs and process owners, and it handles broad board-level IT governance by taking those high-level stakeholder needs and cascading them down into technical goals. Then you look at ISO 27701, which is highly specific. It's certifiable and it's focused explicitly on building an information security management system, or ISMS. Essentially, you use COBIT for your overarching strategy and ISO 27701 to execute and audit the specific on-the-ground security controls.
If we zoom in on how ISO 27001 operates, it facilitates continuous improvement through this really elegant loop known as the PDCA cycle. Plan, do, check, act. It's exactly what it sounds like. You plan your controls, you implement or do them, you check them with internal audits, and then you act to correct any failures you found. This cycle actively shifts security from being just an isolated, one-time IT task into a constantly evolving business enabler that adapts right alongside the company.
Which brings us to Part 3, the security policy hierarchy, also known as our building code. Okay, so management has a strategy, but how do they actually force the entire enterprise to follow it without it just sounding like a polite suggestion? Well, high-level intent has to cascade down through an organization's security hierarchy. At the very top, you have the policy. This is management's strategic mandate. It is strictly mandatory, but it purposefully doesn't mention specific technologies. Right beneath that, you have standards. These dictate your measurable targets, like passwords must be 12 characters. Then come baselines, which set the minimum platform configurations.
After that, we have procedures, which are your step-by-step operational instructions. And finally, guidelines, which are actually the only optional advisory best practices on this entire list. Everything has to flow top-down. If you just go and create operational procedures in a vacuum without a foundational policy backing them up, they honestly have zero enforcement authority.
All right, on to Phase 4, legal standards of conduct, which act as our legal defenses.
Because let's be real for a second, breaches are going to happen. With our rules in place, we absolutely must look at the legal building codes that protect leadership from total professional ruin. When a disaster inevitably strikes, leadership is going to be judged, and not just on the technical failure of some firewall, but on their legal and ethical benchmarks of responsibility. In the eyes of the law, the real question is, did they do what they were reasonably supposed to do?
And that brings us to two concepts that honestly get mixed up all the time, but they are vitally distinct. First is due care. This is the action. It's the actual act of acting responsibly. For example, physically patching a vulnerable system or installing automated backups. Due diligence, on the other hand, is the continuous homework. It's the research and verification. It's going back and auditing the logs to verify that the patches you just installed actually worked. Put simply, due care is doing, due diligence is knowing. All of this actually roots back to something called the prudent person rule. Originating from a pretty famous court case in the 1830s, this rule dictates that leadership must act with the exact same care and caution that a reasonable, prudent person would use when managing their own money or affairs. So failing to document your due diligence steps, that isn't just a minor oversight. Legally, it is considered negligence. And what's truly terrifying for businesses is that liability insurance often won't even cover an incident if it's the result of professional negligence. That leads us perfectly into Section 5, Risk Management and Resilience. Basically, our alarm and defense systems. So, when disaster does strike, how do we measure survival? This timeline maps out our absolute survival metrics, formerly known as risk management and the business impact analysis. Point 2 here is the event, the crash. Looking backward, we have the recovery point objective, or RPO. This is exactly how much past data we can afford to lose. Basically, if your RPO is 1 hour, you better be backing up every hour. Looking forward, we have the recovery time objective, or RTO. That's your target time to get the systems back online. And further down the line is the maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD. The vital, absolute must-know strategic takeaway here is that your RTO must always be shorter than your MTD. You need that gap to provide a safety buffer against total, irreversible business failure. But remember, none of us are operating in a vacuum anymore. Modern businesses are heavily reliant on external dependencies. We're talking AWS, Azure, telecom providers, and power grids. So your blueprint has to rigorously audit these external third-party risks. You need to ensure that their service-level agreements actually align with your own recovery objectives. And perhaps most importantly, your failovers must be exercise-tested. Because let's face it, an untested backup is really just a wish.
And that brings us to our sixth and final phase, the human element, or staffing the building.
We've reached the climax of our blueprint. We've got our walls, our policies, our alarms, but at the end of the day, every framework and failover completely depends on human operators. And when you're dealing with humans, you have to understand the critical difference between accountability and responsibility. Accountability is the ultimate ownership of a risk or an asset, and here's the kicker. It cannot be delegated. A CEO or a data owner holds accountability and has to answer to the board for a breach. Responsibility, however, is the specific task execution. The CEO isn't the one configuring the firewall. The IT administrator holds the delegated responsibility to actually get that done. To actually make this work in practice, we rely on standard roles. Senior management sponsors the policy. The CISO coordinates the overall program. The data owner classifies the data, and the data custodian, which is usually an IT admin, implements the technical backups. By explicitly defining these roles, we establish what's called a segregation of duties. This ensures that absolutely no single individual ever has enough unchecked privilege to secretly compromise a critical organizational process. Because ultimately, all these architectural frameworks, the complex encryption algorithms, and those detailed impact analysis, they all point back to one core truth. Organizational security is only as strong as the people who operate and govern it. The entire goal here is moving security professionals out of isolated, backroom technical support roles and transforming them into deeply integrated strategic partners who can drive the business forward safely. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really think about. Take a hard look at your own organizational blueprint.
Look at your frameworks, your policies, and your recovery metrics, and ask yourself, are your foundations genuinely built to survive the modern threat landscape? Or are you just waiting around for the storm to hit?